Hey, everybody. This is Jason, and welcome back to another Leadership Lessons interview in combination with Comparably and Entrepreneur Media. I'm really happy to be joined today by Deb Liu, the CEO of Ancestry. Hey, Deb, how's it going?
Thank you for inviting me. It's going great.
It's a real pleasure and honor to have you here. It's an incredible business that you help lead, one that I've been so fascinated with for so many years and is making a huge impact on so many folks' lives. So excited to get into it. And for those of you that are joining us here for the first time, this is an incredible series that we do with amazing leaders of public companies, of technology companies, of household brands like Ancestry, where we have an open and candid conversation, and if I knew then conversation about different leadership lessons. Again, I'm Jason Azar. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Comparably. We're an employee review platform where we help make companies more transparent and help folks understand their culture and help organizations with their employer brand and recruitment marketing. I'm very proud to share that it was just over 2 months ago that we were acquired by ZoomInfo. So we're now part of a much larger organization that's really the go-to-market leader in all SaaS solutions, in my opinion. And I'm a serial entrepreneur. So I've been starting and building businesses for the last 20 years. And it's folks like you, Deb, that I've just had such an amazing opportunity to learn from and grow from. And I know there's so many thousands of people that you touched in so many ways to help them in their career. So we're excited to dive in. To start, I think everyone here is super familiar with Ancestry, but in your own words, how do you talk about and explain the business today?
Yeah, Ancestry is the leader in family history. We really connect people with their past, their present, and hopefully an archive for their future too, their children and beyond. We really want to help everyone discover, craft, and connect around their family story. And every family has these incredible stories that are hidden there somewhere, and we want to help you discover that. We've actually had Ancestry members create over 120 million family trees. We have the world's largest consumer DNA network with over 20 million users having tested their DNA and actually matched with other people on our platform. And we have 3.9 million subscribers and over 30 billion records from 80 countries. We have spent the last almost 40 years, 35 to 40 years, really amassing, the best content in the world to help you discover your family history and trace back your roots.
Yeah. So you have been an incredibly successful executive. And you had a lot of choices before you joined Ancestry. So I think it's just about, a little under 2 years that you've been the CEO there. How did you make the decision of all the organizations that were, I'm sure, recruiting you and wanted you to help, lead their companies? Why Ancestry? Why did that stand out for you?
What's really special about Ancestry is it's really focused on helping people connect. I think we've gone through a couple really tough years where we lost 1 million people in America to COVID. We have gone through a lot where we've been in lockdown, where people haven't been able to see their family. And it was during that time that I got the call about Ancestry. And the thing about Ancestry is it's not just what's happening today, but it's what's happened in your family for the last several hundred years that brought you to where you are today. And I just remember spending some time on the site and looking at immigration records for people in my family who came to America and what drove them there, and seeing records from other families talking to people who have discovered roots and connections that they never could have imagined. And I realized there was just something really special about we are part of the human family, and how we can connect with one another actually takes away our differences and actually focuses on our commonalities. And that's what was really important to me. And it really touched me at a time in my life when, I have kids, they're teenagers now, a couple of them are teenagers now. And I realized that, your family is so much more important than you ever imagined. And that connection and, that is something which I wanted to foster for them as well. And so when the call came and I spent some time researching, I realized this was the place I really wanted to be.
Yeah. I think a lot of folks tend to, remember businesses like Ancestry as the place where you can, build and discover your family tree and kind of trace back different generations. But as you talked about, there's so many more things. I mean, with what you're doing with DNA, matching families, can you talk about 2 or 3 of kind of these like unique stories of how you're helping people with medical conditions? You talked about this amazing Juneteenth story. We're here now in June 2022. What are some things that are Ancestry's kind of making happen that people may not realize the platform's powering?
Well, one of the things that Ancestry does is it actually spends a tremendous amount of resources around gathering and collecting and curating at-risk records, as we call them. So Freedmen's Bureau was a bureau that was put together after the end of slavery to help document what happened to people so they can share what happened with their families. They can actually find ways to connect with one another. And with the Freedmen's Bureau, we found a letter, and it was from somebody named Hawkins, and Hawkins Wilson. He was looking for his family. He had been sold basically he had been with his family in Virginia, and he was sold off. He was actually collateral for someone else's debt. And when they couldn't pay their debt, they sold him off and they moved him to Texas. And he was a child, and he had left his family. And 24 years later, after the end of slavery, he actually wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau and said, I would like to find my mother, my sisters. Here's the name of everyone I remember. And if you find my sister Jane, here's a letter to her about what my life is like today, 24 years later. And, that letter never made it to his family, and it was found in the Freedmen's Bureau archive. And so actually with a partnership with several leaders, including Anthony Anderson, they were able to pull together a family member that they found that's a direct descendant, a great granddaughter, I believe, who they met and actually brought to the courthouse where he was sold, and actually brought them to North Carolina, where they were able to connect with family, direct descendants also of Hawkins's uncle. And so you think about a family that was broken apart during slavery and how so many generations later you can reconnect. And that's the power of the story, is to find this letter and to really bring together people, and so many generations later who are connected. They might have run into each other before and never known that they were connected to each other. And so, but this is what's hidden in our family history. There's so much special, and those records were at risk. And we had worked with the Freedmen's Bureau to actually capture those records, scan them, digitize them, index them, and make them freely available to anybody who wants to look up their history, tracing back to the times of slavery.
Yeah. And so what you're doing with the DNA matching, it's a lot more sophisticated, right, than just people putting in records and user-generated content of, here's our family tree. Like if I went in today and, did a DNA sample, you'd be able to match across millions of other people that have been connected on Ancestry, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you do your DNA test, you can actually connect with, we found people who had found full siblings that they didn't know existed. We hear stories of people who found biological parents that they were adopted and never knew where, their biological parents are from. And they were able to meet their biological parents, their father that had left and didn't connect, didn't know about them. They were able to connect. And you just hear these amazing stories of people who discover, sometimes challenging, but sometimes, just eye-opening and glorious discoveries about their own lives that they never knew. And it has been, you cannot go to a party without someone telling you their ancestry story, which is discovering relatives, discovering records, just something really special. And that's what makes it really interesting. I go to a party and I hear so many incredible stories of new branches of families that are found, new connections, uncles that were lost, had moved to another country, never heard from again, meeting cousins. And so these are these stories that really make Ancestry what it is, which is, you kind of unfolding a chapter of history, going backwards in time and looking, and then hopefully telling the future stories too, that you want to capture for your family.
All right. So I want to go back into your history a little bit. And I'm always so fascinated with folks' origin stories. So you've had this incredible career that I think many folks, rightfully so, look up to and admire and think, well, how could I do something like that? Where did that ambition and drive come from? Did you have a model of where you wanted to be, at a young age? Did you think to yourself, there's something big and special I want to do? Or how did that kind of all unfold for you?
So I was born in New York City. My family had actually moved. A lot of my parents and my aunts and uncles had moved, and we all lived in the same neighborhood in New York City in Jackson Heights. And my dad he was an engineer, and he had received his engineering degree, but the company he worked for refused to honor it. He was positioned as a technician, and he felt like it was discrimination. He pushed back, and they just kept saying, no, we're not going to honor it. We're not going to make you an engineer at the company. And so a friend of his called him and said, hey, I moved from New York to South Carolina. The government doesn't discriminate. They're definitely going to honor your degree. So his friend called him and said, come move down to South Carolina. I'm not sure.
Isn't that so crazy that you had to move from New York to South Carolina to avoid discrimination?
Well, that is what is amazing about the story, which is, when you look back, by the way, in a lot of ancestry, people just pick up and move and change the fate of their family with one decision, one call from his friend. And suddenly he's like, you know what, we're going to move to the state we've never been to, a place we never even heard of. And my parents picked up, moved us to South Carolina. And, his friend kind of settled him in. They worked for the government. My dad worked for the government for the next 20 years, and he advanced in his career, and he was very successful in doing that. And we moved to a place where it was less than 1% Asian. And so I went from a place where I spoke mostly my native language with my family. I lived in a place where everybody looked like me, to a place where no one looked like me and no one had any idea what to do with someone like me. And I spent the next, so I moved when I was 6, and, I grew up in South Carolina until I was 18. I graduated and I went to college. And during those 12 years were really formative, because I learned that being really different and being, I was the other, no matter where I went. I couldn't hide from that. And I really struggled with that. And I just had so much fight in me. And I kept saying, you know what, if I could just get out of this place, if I could just show them that I am worth something, I'm going to go to college, get a scholarship, leave this place and never look back. And that was the fight I had in me for so many years. And that's what drove me. There wasn't some grand plan, as you're asking, instead it was, I'm going to leave this place and never have to look back. And that worked until it didn't work. It was rocket fuel for my life. It was rocket fuel for me to get to college. I got a scholarship to Duke. I went on to do consulting. I went on to go to business school. And that fight just kept going and going until many, many years later. Actually, Cheryl pulled me aside and she's like, you can stop fighting now. And, I realized that fight that had made me so successful in school, that powered me through every single thing that I had ever done in my life, was not working anymore, because it was alienating. It was difficult in my relationships. I just, I had to back off, and I had to really come to terms with the fact that the thing that drove me and got me to where I was not going to get me to where I wanted to go.
Yeah. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction for a moment. And I know we're going to get to topic of the work-life balance. You've got 3 kids. I talk on this show a lot. We've got 2 little boys at home and, a growing family. One of the things I always think about, Deb, is, that adversity was so formative to you. And I think it's been to so many of us, like you. My dad was an immigrant, and I think it so much colored our experience. And as a parent, I always try to, it's interesting. It's the same philosophy that I struggle with as a parent that I do as a business leader too, which is, how supportive and easy should I be trying to make it for my kids and for my team, versus folks having to go through their own trial by fires, because those trial by fires really shape and mold you. And I think, as you talked about, give you that rocket fuel that helps you accomplish, meaningful, important things. How do you think about that balance, both as a parent, but how do you think about it as a manager for your team, of when to show tough love versus when to be more empathetic?
Well, I think that's one of the things that's really hard for people who've been relatively successful in their lives, is the thing that made them successful, they shield their family from, they shield their team from. And that is a huge dichotomy. We wish we didn't have to go through those really tough formative experiences, and yet they are the things that make us who we are today. And then we say, you know what, we want our children to never go through any adversity. How does that work that way, right? We want to smooth their way no matter what. And I struggle with that a lot, because I think if you ask people, do you wish you could take away all those formative experiences? Most people would say no, that even though it's painful, even though it's hard, those things are what shaped you to be the person to go found companies, to go, take risks, to go, fight for the things that you want. And I think the same thing is true of our teams. The things that make us successful and made us successful as leaders, we shield our teams from too. And it's a dangerous thing. I think instead, having people understand, even if they're not experiencing it directly, having them understand, the context, having them really feel what it's like to have to fight for resources, to have to budget, to, instead of actually just smoothing the way so that it's easy. I think that is an incredibly important lesson. And one of the things that I hope we can build more in the next generation is resilience. But if we protect everybody from those things, who's building resilience? I do think the last couple of years have taught us a lot of resilience for external reasons, which, but I do think if you look back at, what you wish for your family, what you wish for your teams, what you wish for your company, is that they have the easiest time. And actually that might not be the best thing for them.
Yeah. So let's talk about that in the business context for a second. And before we do that, do you mind showing the mug that you've got? I thought it was so cool.
So right. I carry this Be the Nerd. I carry a water bottle everywhere I go. And I've estimated I've saved like 1,000 water bottles in the time that I've carried it in the last 3 years.
Yeah. And it was a great story behind it too. You can share. the thing that really resonates with me when you told the story that you just did, and when you showed me the mug before we started the interview, is, that was very much my experience in the sense that I never felt like I fit in grade school and high school. I played sports, but I was definitely not popular. I was always on the outside. And I think there was a bit of a chip on my shoulder that I had of, hey, I'm going to show everybody what I can do and what I can accomplish here. And moving this back to business for a second, how do you think about building resilience in a business context, right? Especially now, as a lot of folks are seeing markets evolve and change, and experiences that employees may have had as candidates, are going to change and evolve here over the next 5 years as well too. Bill Gurley had this great post on Twitter just the other day where he talked about, we all need to be prepared for how the expectations around work are going to change. How do you think about building resilience in the right way today? Because I think one thing you and I probably agree on is, more than ever before, I think team members are looking for empathetic leaders that understand the challenges that they're going through and work-life balance. And if I wish I worked for you, and you could mentor me on how to do that more effectively.
Jason, I think one of the things that I rough seas make good sailors, right? If you've never experienced any adversity, do you really know? Have you been tested? And, for people who came out, it's like, there are people who come out during recessions and go through a tough time. And then there are those who come out. If you graduated since, 2008, 2009, the market has been up and to the right. Stock only goes up, the S&P, you just have seen a world where every investor thinks that they're brilliant. And the market has just, the tide is just lifting all boats. And now you're seeing, as people are facing adversity, they haven't built that resilience. They haven't said, hey, in the last downturn, what did we do? How do we weather through this? And I think a lot of times leaders are really worried about exposing the teams to say, hey, this is where we are. But I actually think that more transparency, helping people see that this is hard and that they're part of the team in this rough storm, as opposed to kind of hiding them in the back and saying, okay, a few people are going to sail the ship. We are all in the ship together. And so I think is that kind of openness and exposure and saying, we are in the ship, we are sailing together, and we will get through the storm. And we have more control than we think we do. As opposed to people just buffeted by the waves going back and forth and saying, well, I don't know what's happening upstairs. Like, what's the senior leadership doing? But, we are all on the ship and we can all sail through this storm together. And I think the companies that are more transparent, open, and willing to enlist their employees to help sail are the ones that are going to be the strongest coming through the other side.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. There's an interesting balance that I have, admittedly so, I don't think ever gotten right. I've tried to get better at it as the years have gone on. What I've talked about is that as entrepreneurs and high, profile execs like yourself, you're so validated for the things that you can do early on. People make seed investment in an entrepreneur because she's exceptional and she did all these amazing things with very little resources. And so you get a lot of external credit for the things that you can often do yourself. And then you build a team, and, we need to transition to helping those people do things successfully, but we feel the pull sometimes, well, if it doesn't go well, I'm just going to step in and do it myself. Right. And here you are, you're running an organization of 1,500 folks. Obviously that kind of philosophy doesn't work at a company of scale of yours. How do you know when it's time for you to step in and be more directive in a situation and help more, intentionally guide an outcome versus really just setting the direction and strategy and empowering and making your team feel responsible that, hey, this is your job and you got to make sure this happens?
Well, one thing that I look for is when you make a decision, when you step in, is this something repeatable? The next time this happens, do you have to step in again? Or is the system self-healing? Is it learning? Is it a learning organization? Is the process set into place that the next decision is easier? I think sometimes it's easy to step in and say, okay, great, we're going to do X. And then there's no more fighting, there's no more, misprioritization, and you move on. But then the next time you have to do it again and again and again. And so I always ask myself, what do we do this time? And how do we prevent this from having to happen again? But getting everyone in a room and say, hey, we're going to have a decision-making process, and here's what we're going to do. And actually teaching how to actually not have to get into the situation again. I think that's incredibly powerful. I think it's a lot of times, it's one of those things where, as the entrepreneur, as the leader, that you have that capability, you have the authority to step in, untie the knot and move on. But why are things getting knotted? How do you teach other people to unknot things? And really, it's easy to, in the short term, to say, okay, I stopped the short term pain, but actually you're creating much more long term pain, because now all the teams go, well, maybe she wants to weigh in on this, or maybe I want to escalate this, and suddenly you're creating a dependency on you making decisions, and you're just not as good at making decisions, especially when I tell people on my team, you spend 100% of your time thinking about this problem. You should know better than me what the answer is. I have something very different, which is I have the ability to look across multiple problems and areas, but you actually know this problem better than me. And so you should come in with a recommendation. And if someone disagrees with you, let's just have that conversation. And instead of actually looking upward to have someone else solve the problem, because I am actually much less equipped to solve the problem.
I love that. Is there any example either at Ancestry or at Facebook or any other organization you were part of that exemplifies that? A time that maybe you needed to help folks unpack what was going on and step out of saying, well, I'm just going to make the call here. Let me create a framework of how you all can, solve these issues going forward.
So something we actually implemented at Ancestry, we actually learned from Intuit, and we sat down with the Intuit leadership team and spent some time with the CTO, Mariana, as well as their transformation officer, Holger. And they taught us kind of how they did decision-making. And we've actually used parts of their model. And part of the model is you have a meeting once a month. We call it the execution meeting. And you bring all problems there. All your basically, most of your VPs are there who work on execution. A lot of the key single-threaded owners are there. And then everyone brings red, yellow, green, where they are, the status is on every project that you're following, every track. And what's been fascinating is at first, there's a lot of things that are red or yellow. And suddenly by the second or third meeting, things start resolving themselves before the meeting. And so now people are like, well, do we really need this meeting? Everything seems to be resolved. And I said, the purpose of the meeting is not to resolve the issues. The purpose of the meeting is to know that if things get to a place, that there's a forum where we can escalate and have conversations. But most people now have the incentive to resolve the situation before it arises in front of everybody else in the company. And again, a lot of these are business decisions that make sense either way. It's just some of them are one-way doors, some of them are two-way doors. And a lot of times now you see teams say, you know what, we just went ahead and tested it because we don't fight about it. Or, hey, we chose to do X instead of Y. And it's just, smooth decision-making and made it a lot easier. And I said, the meeting would be incredible if there were 5 minutes and everybody said, we agree on everything. Because then everything happened before the meeting and it's done. If we spent hours here trying to untangle why so-and-so said this and why so-and-so disagreed with that, we're going to end up wasting a lot of people's time. And I said, the perfect meeting is that we no longer have to have this meeting, and we sit down, we look and we go, thank you very much. Everything is green, we move on. And that's a lesson that is really teaching the organization to solve problems, but also giving them a forum where if you can't solve it, they know exactly every month there's an opportunity to raise this with everybody in the room.
Yeah. And so today, how many direct reports do you have? 8. And how do you think about managing those direct reports so that they're most effective across the organization? How often do you meet with them? What kind of conversations do you have? What do you feel like you need to do uniquely and especially with all of them to have as much impact across the organization?
Well, one thing I think a lot of new managers don't realize over time is as you grow as a leader, you start managing people who are so much better at you than everything. So when you first start out, your first line manager, they promote you because you're the best and most expert at the thing, right? You're an engineer, you become a tech lead, you become an engineering manager, you are a PM or designer, you're a very good designer, you organize work, you're the design lead, you're the design manager. You are the person who can do everyone else's job if any of them went on vacation. And as you grow, you actually take on other functions where you are not the expert anymore. You are now somebody who's leading an organization, maybe a GM. So you are running different functions. And, a lot of managers really never make that shift from first line, I need to be able to do everything better than everybody on my team so I can teach them, to I am a leader to help organize the work and help them be the best that they can possibly be. And I use this example a lot. Now I manage the general counsel. I am not a lawyer. My husband's a general counsel at many companies. He tells me, how no CEO ever understands what the general counsel goes through. And, and he's absolutely right. And I said to him, and my general counsel is incredible. And I said, look, I can't teach you to be a better lawyer, but I can teach you, here are the things that I can't help you with. I can, unblock things. I can help you think about how we weigh business risk and legal risk. We can talk about, how you can be in the room and be a part of the conversation as we open doors. These are the kinds of things that I can work with you on. And these are the things I will not be able to give you a legal opinion on anything, and I should not. And, and we're very honest about that. And the same thing with finance, your CFO and the areas that you're not expert in, you're relying on their expertise, but your job is to use your judgment to make them the best, CFO or, general counsel that they can possibly be, but really enabling them also to lead and blossom. And so each of the one-on-ones, I do a one-on-one for 45 minutes every other week. I also do staff meetings where everybody's in the same room for an hour and a half every week as well. But I think it's, the one-on-ones are really important to talk about kind of within organization issues, but I actually spend more time on the staff, the senior leadership team meetings, because I want less asymmetry of information and everyone actually having the conversation together. I think one thing that people do is they have long one-on-ones and short staff meetings. But it's actually the meetings where you're together, where all information is transparent. Everyone knows what everyone else knows. And I think people don't rely enough on that with their direct reports and actually opening the door and saying, hey guys, we've had this dispute for a long time. We need to close this. We're going to get on the same page. We're bringing a team in to talk about it. And we're going to decide today what we're going to do. And I use those techniques to kind of really help kind of break down the silos, because it's easy for you to have a great relationship with every single one of your direct reports, but they don't talk to each other. And then you become the single point of failure. You have to actually make all the decisions. And that's not the best way to actually lead. Instead, it's really getting all the facets of information from all the different leaders. That's the magic. And so really, I focus a little bit less on having long one-on-ones, like, hourly for every week, but really invest a lot more on doing a quarterly offsite for several hours. We do a full day offsite every quarter. We do board prep together. We also do a weekly senior leadership team meeting. That's an hour and a half.
I love that. Is there anything, so you had this incredible, I think, decade-long career at Facebook as a very senior exec, and helped launch Marketplace and a lot of incredible achievements there. Once you took on the CEO spot at Ancestry, was there anything that evolved in your management style, or that even with all the success and all the folks you managed before, you're like, oh, this is something new that I added into my, an arrow added into my quiver that I didn't leverage before?
No matter how senior you are as a GM at another company, you will never have the same purview as a CEO. Part of it is that there's always an HR team is making, decisions that you don't have to think about, right? Like, we would weigh in on things, but really, the decision wasn't made by any of the individual GMs. What we did with benefits, what we did with, COVID lockdowns, what we were getting, the travel policies. So many things are taken care of for you when you're at a company where we have to make decisions around like which days we're going to take as holidays. Last year we did a shutdown between Christmas and New Year's. That is a decision that ultimately you make that someone else was making previously, and that's something I learned, which is so many things in a company just happen when you're at the company and when you actually have visibility into the minutia of deciding what is our exact hybrid or return to work policy. And, what is our policy around, holidays during COVID versus, when people are going back to work? How do we do, should we have a holiday party this year? Because now we have a lot of people who work remotely. Those are questions that are open, by the way, and we don't have answers to, but these are important for the culture of the company and the culture of the choices that you make. And for so long, when you're within a large organization, those things are just, they tell you whether there's a holiday party, they tell you what the travel policy is, and those things are just ticked off and you never really think about it. But the intentionality of being a leader is really thinking about what are the choices you're making that shape the culture? How do we prevent burnout? How do we help teams that are have never met anyone, people have been at the company for 2 years? Should we what should we do? Those are real choices, and I think those are really new, and it's been a really amazing adventure. A lot of these I talked about are related to the time we're in now, but the evolution of leadership when you're company is remote or hybrid is also going to evolve over the next 5-10 years as well. And in uncharted territory. No matter who you talk to, no one else has gone through this either. And so really kind of learning as you go is part of the journey.
Yeah. So I'm interested to get your take on that, on what your crystal ball tells you about the future of work and in office. You know, you got someone like Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, who said, working in an office is antiquated in the modern environment where people can be so successful and productive at home. There's absolutely no reason to work in an office, and we're going to be a forever remote organization. And you've got Elon Musk that just came out and said, no, this is, I'm calling BS here, and people aren't as productive, and I'm going to, require that my team is back in the office for at least 40 hours a week.
Cool. So, one thing I did when I first joined is I asked each of the leaders, do you think your team is equally productive, less productive, and more productive during lockdown? And by the way, everyone said equally productive or more productive. But the thing that they lost, and everybody cited this as well, is that it's the cross collaboration. It's the magic of, sitting around the water cooler or talking about something and going, oh, that's a great idea. I should connect you with so-and-so. That's what we lost. And so it's not the actual absolute productivity. I actually think most studies have shown that people who work from home are as productive, if not more productive, because they're no longer commuting, they're not parking, they're not, but I actually think that the thing we lost is something a little bit different, which is there's something special when people get together in person that just doesn't happen over Zoom. And so the question is, how do you get the best of both worlds? That people have flexibility to take their kids to school or pick them up in the middle of the day if they need to, if they're sick, and they don't have to worry about, finding childcare. At the same time, how do we still have the in-person specialness of building those connections? I think that the thing we don't acknowledge is we've been in this for 2 years, but a lot of the relationships were built before. The infrastructure of the network that you have within your companies were built well before COVID happened. You're still coasting on those relationships. But what happens when a company is 100% remote and started during COVID? What happens when 80% of the people started during a time when they've never met anybody else? And I think that that's going to be a huge test for us. Our policy, by the way, is that we let people choose. If you want to come into the office, we have offices available. If you want to do hybrid, you can come in as many 2 or 3 days a week. If you want to go fully remote, that's possible as well. And so we have given full choice on that, and we just said we trust you, and we trust that this organization is going to continue. But the one thing I do want to encourage is there is something special about getting together. So the answer of never getting together is probably the wrong answer too. And so the question is, what are the right moments to pull people together so that they can connect with each other and still get to know each other in the casual way that makes work part of not just let's just talk about business for 25 minutes in a 30-minute meeting. Instead, let's actually spend some time doing an offsite, spending time together, talking about things that are outside of work, or even brainstorming new ideas together and having a good time kind of learning about each other, something that you never would have done if you just never had the downtime between meetings.
Yeah. It's interesting. A lot of the data that I've seen shows that it's folks that are under 30 that are the most adamant about requiring to work for a remote organization. But from my point of view, I think that's the population that most needs the in-person interaction for the mentorship, for the training, for the socialization. I think it's a raw deal that a lot of people that are early in their career have gone in of not having the benefit of being around other folks. I think it's one of the things that it feels good in the short term. It's the kid in the candy store. I love being in here. Like, this is what I want. But over a longer term, I'm not sure it's going to help benefit folks in their career as much as they may be thinking, or it may be holding them back more than they think.
Well, that's one thing that I think, especially early in your career, where you need that hands-on apprenticeship. That is really hard to replicate. I mean, it is. So one thing that we did, and last summer we made this decision, and we were one of the few companies that did, we did an in-person internship last year, and we're doing it again this year. And last year was not, it was a little bit unusual. Most companies went remote with their internships. We chose to do it in person optionally. So we asked any intern if they chose to come in, they could. If they wanted to do it remote, 100% of them chose to come in. And this year we had thousands of people apply to our internships. And so clearly there's some hunger to be in person. And I met with the interns yesterday, and they were just so incredibly motivated to be right close to their mentors, to be able to unblock themselves, to ask a question of someone else who's sitting 5 feet away from you, as opposed to, hey, can I set up a 15-minute Zoom meeting, ask you how to do X? I think there's some magic there that I hope we don't lose. And I do think that we all benefited from learning hands-on, asking questions that seem really dumb to send an email about to a person you just turned around in your cube and said, hey, can you help me with X? I hope we don't lose that. And I do worry that we will, because one of the things I don't think we realize is what we lose. It's kind of like when we went to remote school. Now they're seeing the learning loss. But, early on, we just didn't know. And I think I don't want that for the next generation of workers. I do want them to have the flexibility, though. And I do think that the honoring flexibility so that you can maybe spend a month a year, traveling and working from wherever, or maybe even 6 months a year, that is great. But, never seeing somebody, never building those connections. I think that we're going to see there's a lot of loss in growth and learning, the ability to learn from other people who you're not like, not the serendipitous discovery that companies, new ideas come from. All of those things I think we're going to miss.
All right. So we're going to do the time machine question now that we talk about 20s and 30-year-olds. So if you could take a time machine, Deb, into your 20s, what professional advice would you give yourself and why?
So the thing I would say, which is always be learning. If you are the expert at something, that's great. But, if you're someone else is the expert and you're a learner, you're going to exceed them someday. If you're somebody who's flexible, takes feedback, you're constantly learning, you are always going to grow more and faster in your career. And I've seen that, given the choice between two candidates, and we've actually come down to this many times where one person has better experience, more expert, but the other person is more eager, more passionate, a faster learner, is more open. And we have never regretted making the choice of the person who has the learning mindset. And so I want that for all of you. It's like when you're in school, you're absorbing things, you feel like that's your learning time. When you go out to the workforce, I feel like sometimes people have a switch where like, okay, I just need to know what I need to do here. But actually, your role in life is so much more than just doing your job today well. The question is, you need to actually build a career beyond your job. Where do you want to go in 5, 10 years? And how is what you're doing today getting you closer to there?
All right, if you could take that same time machine into your 30s and you could give yourself any professional or personal piece of advice, what would that be?
I think in your 30s, the one thing I've seen in your 30s is a lot of people actually struggle with the work-life balance of having a family, especially a young family. And I went through that. I had 3 very difficult pregnancies. I had one, so 2 of my kids couldn't breastfeed. My last one actually had colic for a year. It was just awful. And my middle child actually was sick for an entire year. We didn't know what was wrong with her. They're all fine now. They're all great. But each of them, I just went through so much. And I just remember thinking, I can't do this. And I was fortunate to have tons of support. I have an incredible partner, and my husband is just so great. But also and by the way, no one ever tells you this, I had a ton of people helping me. My parents came in and spent months helping me with the kids. And I feel like it's verboten to say that you had help, but that's the danger, is that so much of what we succeed, people are like, oh yeah, I succeeded alone. I did everything. I had 3 kids. I had 3 pregnancies. Like, no, that is absolutely the wrong answer. The answer is, we can't, it takes a village to raise a child, and people used to live close to their family. They used to have a lot of support. And we just say, yep, you got to do it alone or you don't do it. And so many people feel like, well, I'm failing at this. Maybe I should drop out of the workforce. Maybe I should take a part-time job. Maybe I need to step back. Instead, we say, the people who succeed had a ton of help. What help do you need, and how can I help you? And I had managers who encouraged me and supported me when I had to take time off. And I just think we are not open enough about that. And that's to the detriment of a lot of employees, where we say, well, why can't you just power through this? I did. That is a terrible message. Instead, say, I had an incredible amount of help. What kind of help can we have? What kind of flexibility do you want? What are ways that we can rearrange things so that we can make this work for you? And I think that we should not talk about those things. And, I had nannies for my kids. I had somebody who came in the morning who loved them like the 3rd grandmother, who cooked them breakfast and took them to school so we could stop fighting about being late to work every day. My husband and I went through a difficult time when they were young. And so I just think we should be much more open about these things, instead of saying, oh yeah, I totally did it, you can do it too. Imagine what that feels like when someone is 30 and struggling with having a colicky child, and you say that to them and you're the senior leader. That's crazy. Instead, you say, I went through that and here's how I got through it. And
have you heard those kinds of conversations happen where in the past?
I do. I think before we would just, you never talked about home.
Yeah.
It was like home just stopped when you got to work, and then it started when you got home. And I think now there's a new era of openness where people can talk about, physical challenges they have, the challenges they have with their children, mental health issues. I actually think that's really healthy, because now we're not saying, okay, we're just going to pretend nothing ever happened and you should just do it. We should say, hey, you know what? We all face challenges. Let's actually problem solve together. What are the things that we can do together to enable you to do this? And I think that conversation, opening up about that conversation, I recently wrote a post about it where I just said, hey, I had a lot of help to get to where I am today. I did not do this alone. And so many people reached out and told me, I always felt like I was failing because I wasn't able to do this. And I said, I think this should not be verboten to talk about it. I think we should sing the praises of all the people who helped us get to where we are today. And if we hide from that, how are we teaching the next generation to get there?
Yeah. As you look back over the last 10 years of your career, is there anything that you look back on and think, hey, I really, improved in that area, or, I wish I had done that differently? I've got a long list of 1,000 of those things.
So the thing that I have worked really hard on, and I hope that I've gotten closer to where I want to go, is I was extremely introverted before. So it might not look like that today, but, I grew up in a place where I tried to hide from who I was. If no one notices me, maybe they won't comment on the fact that I'm really different. They won't say, go back to where you came from. And so I just spent my whole childhood just hiding from everything. Like, if I can be as unexceptional, uncommentable as possible. And that worked until I got to business school and consulting. And consulting, you're connecting with the clients, you spend a lot of time on client service. I was really bad at that part. I was very good at the analysis, terrible at the client service part of client service. And then I got to business school, and 30% of your grade is class participation. And I thought, this is terrible. Engineering school was amazing. You just turn in your problem sets, take the test, you graduate with honors, right? And so I realized that the workforce does have a bias that I think we don't acknowledge. We have an extreme bias towards extroversion and the ability to speak about anything on a dime. Think about how you judge people on your teams. We go through these calibrations where we talk about different leaders, and they're like, oh, that person is great because they're able to answer this question. I'm like, that's 5 minutes of their time. Like that's like 5% of their job that you're judging them on. And then judge somebody who's really quiet. Well, they don't really have an opinion. I'm like, they could be incredible at their job, but because in these meetings they don't show up, that is what you're judging them on. And I think that's a really dangerous thing. And so I do think that's something which I've been working on a lot, which is the comfort level of going into spaces and being myself and, accepting that that's an important part of the job. That is a really difficult skill to learn. I've worked on it. I've had speaking coaches for years. I have worked on this extremely hard, and I still feel like I'm not that great at it. But I think for a lot of people who are introverted, that is a hard thing because, in your head, you're like, this is not me. But I've learned the skills to actually do this because it is so important to success in the workplace.
And so as managers and leaders, what do you think is the right model to help support and let those introverts blossom a little bit more? Is it about giving them more time to go through the analysis? Is it about giving a different environment? Like, how do you think about supporting folks on your team that maybe were like you 20 years ago?
So I do think that that's a really important question, which is, how do we support people? So I don't know if you read Susan Cain's Quiet. It's a book about how introverts can be really powerful in the workplace and actually really outperform in certain areas. I just think we have this bias is really a subconscious bias that we have towards people who are able to speak, on a dime. So one thing I do is before we go into meetings, I actually ask people who are introverted, hey, I'd like you to speak on next topic. Yeah. I encourage, for example, we would have all the product managers speak at every event, and the product managers are trained to speak on behalf of the team. And I said, I'd like you to encourage your data scientist or your engineer to actually do the talking for the work that they did. And at first, it's usually the most extroverted person who puts together a presentation on behalf of the team and presents it. But now I said, look, spend your time. And I actually had this incredible PM. He said, I would like my engineering leader to take my place at the all hands to speak about our product. But he spent hours training him. And I saw them practice together. And he trained his engineering leader to speak in an event with like hundreds of people, something that he was not comfortable with. But I was so proud of him for taking the time to invest in someone else. And then also so proud of the engineering leader to step up and do something that he was so uncomfortable with. And so from then on, we said, you know what, we're going to have a slot for each of the people who normally would not speak. let's nominate people who are not the natural best speakers, but instead the people who we want to hear from because they did the work. And sometimes we correlate communication with performance, when communication is a part of performance, but it's not all of it. And so one thing that I did for a lot of my teams, and I'm encouraging this in my teams today, is, how do we actually bring forth the people who are doing the work and give them the opportunity, train them, teach them like this, like any other skill, and then give them the opportunity to shine.
I love that. I can definitely say that I have been guilty of taking up too much airspace and judging people for either positively or negatively for not coming up with the answer quickly enough. And, as you talk about it, it's a good mirror for me to hold up to myself as well, too.
And I absolutely fall into that. I think it's just a natural bias. You are having a conversation with your leadership team, someone's doing a product or, a business review with you. Who do you talk to? The people who respond to your questions. But the answer might actually be in the head of the person who's actually sitting back and uncomfortable. And so one thing we do is like, we send the questions ahead of time, for reviews. We try to prep people, like, here are the kinds of questions we're going to ask. Here are questions. I send notes ahead of time sometimes to seed people with ideas so they have time to prepare so they're not caught off guard.
As you were going through the process of evolving and making that transition from, in a workplace being more introverted to extroverted, because you're clearly, off the charts brilliant, and driven and passionate and, an incredible like educational background and early career. So it's like, did it feel like you were being judged? Did it feel just viscerally uncomfortable? What was that process like of having to put yourself in environments? Because I before we did the interview, we read this, you talked about this, right? How you've consciously put yourself in positions in the work where it forced you to be more extroverted, which I think is incredibly brave and a hard thing to do. But what were the feelings like before where you got to where you're at today?
It feels like you're flying without a net, right? You are hanging out there, and if you fall, you're going to fall flat on your face. But I really believe if you put yourself in situations where you have to rise to the occasion, more often than not, you're going to do it. And so I think sometimes we try to protect ourselves. We're like, well, if we don't, and I spent many years protecting myself, so I know how this works. If you just kind of hide in the back of the room, sit far away from the presentation, then people won't notice, right? But my friend Carol Izazaki calls this the unintentional ridiculous strategy, which is you don't go into a room and you don't say, well, I'm going to add no value to this meeting. You don't actually intentionally do that. You don't say, I'm going to drain the energy out of the room by kind of, frowning the whole time. But how many times do you leave a meeting when you literally have done that? You have not engaged, you have not really shown up, you've kind of multitasked, and you just might as well have not been there. And so instead, one thing I do is I'm very intentional. If I go to a meeting, I'm going to participate. If I'm going to be a part of a conversation, I'm going to really prep for it. And it puts you in a really difficult spot. One thing I told my team, because they said, you're so good at just like answering Q&A questions on the spot. And how can you think that fast? And I said, one thing I do to myself, and this is a very dangerous thing to do, Jason, so you might not want to do this if you're not good at this. It took me years to get this right. I would say there's 3 things we need to do. And they said, well, how do you come up with 3 things? I said, I come up with it as I go along. And they're like, do you ever get to number 3 and not have the answer? I said, not a single time. And they said, how does that work? And I said, but I've taught myself to do this. I've worked at this really hard so that I'm able to think. But it was baffling to them when I said this. And I said, look, it's because now I need to be comfortable in front of a team. And so I've learned to build the skill to be able to answer a question fully. And I always say, okay, there's 3 things you need to do. And I'm literally sometimes coming up with it as we go along. I just remember the look on their faces. It was not, but I realized that, if you teach yourself that skill of actually being able to articulate a problem as you go along, to reframe it, you get better at it. And so now I've gotten much more comfortable. In the beginning, I would freeze on number 2 and I would go, I'm going to start rambling now. But now I've gotten much better at it so that I can answer questions fully this way. But I think, again, it's a skill like any other. It is something I practiced really hard. And I would practice by myself sometimes. If somebody asked me this, what would I say? And I know that seems really weird to practice in your mirror, but you do get more comfortable over time. And it's just like a skill like any other.
I wish I could give you a virtual hug or a fist bump or something right now. My entire team is going to be laughing. I don't know if you and I learned this the same way along the way, but I do the exact same thing. And I have for 20 plus years of there's three things. And it's exactly what you talked about, Deb. I have no idea what those three things are, but I'm organizing my thoughts. You said two things that I think
because I've never met another person who did this. I thought it was very strange, but I love that you've been doing this because it is an interesting skill and it's very useful.
It's really powerful. And I think the interesting thing about it is sometimes there may be actually 8 things, but it forces us to organize into the things that are the most important. And I think there's something powerful. It's of just like, okay, well, there's a list of 3. It sticks with folks. The person receiving it understands it. You said 2 things I want to call out that I think were really meaningful. I think sometimes folks in leadership really discount the importance of just positivity. This entire interview, for example, like you've had this amazing smile on your face and it's infectious and it pulls people in. And I think when folks are in positions of leadership, we don't get the privilege of bringing our own mopiness into work each day because other people are counting and relying on our energy to help them with the fuel that they need for what they do. And then the second thing is I often think folks feel like the speech has to be continuous. Whereas, it's like President Obama probably did this better than anybody, where he would take these long, thoughtful pauses. And there'd be, an 8, 9, 10-second pause between one thought and another. And it doesn't make the person that's listening to you think, oh, well, that person doesn't know what they're saying. It actually gives the person on the receiving end time to process what you've already said and makes them more interested and engaged with what you're about to say. And I just think everything you laid out is such a key component for so many folks. We have just about another minute left here. And so I definitely want to, before we wrap, what's the future of Ancestry look like for you? As you fast forward now, you take that time machine 10 years in the future, what does that business look like to you? And what are you most excited about building with your team?
Well, one thing that we are really focused on since I've been here is Ancestry for All. We have an incredible product when we have records for you, and we have records from vast swaths of Western European countries, the US, across English speaking markets. And that makes our product really magical. You can build your family tree to, the 1500s if you have come from the places where we have incredible records, where we have partnerships with the government. And that is a magical experience I wish more people could experience. And so one of the things I want to do, though, it means that if we don't have records for you, on the flip side, it means that our product is incomplete. And one of the things that we want to do is actually make Ancestry for All, because when you survey people, people who don't come from the heritage that we have the records for, they don't love their family any less. They don't want to not discover their families. It's just that we don't happen to have the records for them. So what if we built a product that's more inclusive, that allows them to store their own records, to upload, photos, to do user-generated content, but also to tell their own stories, collect their recipes from their grandparents, to interview their great grand aunt, who's still alive today. That's work that we need to do, which is making Ancestry not just an amazing treasure trove of collections and documents, but also a living memory storage place where everyone can talk with their families, can engage with their families, can share their family stories. And so that's the evolution that we're working on. That's the next chapter of what we're doing. It means that we're not doing any less. We're actually doing more for the existing users so they can actually interact with their families as well. But we also want to extend that to everybody who wants to research their heritage, that wants to learn more about their experiences and what brought them to where they are today.
That's pretty amazing. Well, Ancestry is certainly very lucky to have you at the helm leading that vision. And we were all very lucky to have you here today, Deb. This was my chance to get to meet you. I had certainly, heard of you and the amazing things you've been doing. You're just so incredibly thoughtful and transparent. I have a copious set of notes that I took from you today for learnings for myself. And thank you so much for being so generous with your time and candor and with everyone here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me. This was a great conversation.
And thank you all for continuing to join us. We're close to 40 interviews in. Our next interview is going to be with the CEO of Redfin. And so we're going to continue to make sure that we bring incredible leaders like Deb here to help share their lessons and experiences with all of you. Thank you all for continuing to join our series. We really appreciate it. See you all soon.